They say time buries everything, that the dust covers the truth, and the wind carries away the rest. But that's a lie. Because out here, the wind doesn't forget. It remembers everything, every gunshot, every scream, every lie told over a shallow grave. It remembers the women the world chose to erase. And sometimes, when the sun falls and the plains go still, the wind begins to whisper their names again. I've heard those whispers. They come soft at first, like a prayer half-spoken. Then they grow louder until you can tell if it's the wind you hear, or their ghosts, asking why you never learned their names. They said the West was no place for women. But it was, because they made it one. They buried their dead, mended the wounds, loaded the rifles. And when men went off to chase glory or vengeance, it was the women who kept the world turning behind them. No one thanked them. No one sang for them. And when they finally broke the rules, when they rode, shot, drank, gambled, when they refused to kneel, the same world that used them spat them out. History wrote about the outlaws and the sheriffs, the duels and the shootouts, but it left out the ones who lit the fires that made those stories possible. They called them dangerous, but it wasn't their guns that frightened people. It was their freedom. Because a woman who answers to no one is the one thing the West could never tame. Some of them carried pistols hidden beneath their skirts. Some carried poison in their rings. Some carried the faces of men they'd outlived. Husbands, lovers, preachers, killers. Each name a chapter in the story the West tried to bury under dust and time. But you can bury the truth. Not forever. There was the widow who picked up her husband's rifle and swore she'd never let another man die the way he did. The gambler who could outplay the devil himself and left towns broken in her wake. The outlaw bride who disappeared on the day of her wedding, leaving only a veil and a wanted poster. The madam who ruled her saloon like a kingdom, who bought lawmen with silver and silence. And the preacher's daughter who set her own church aflame, because she'd seen what holy men did in the dark. These weren't fairy tales. They were blood-soaked, dust-bitten truths. But history doesn't like truth when it comes with a woman's name on it. So they were erased, rewritten as side characters in men's stories, reduced to cautionary tales, or whispers, or graves without markers. Yet, the land remembers. Every broken fence post, every abandoned saloon, every hollow church. The wind moves through them like breath through bones. And still, it speaks. It speaks of the nights when the stars were their only witnesses, when they buried their own secrets with trembling hands. It speaks of laughter echoing from saloon windows long since boarded up. It speaks of gunfire and prayers whispered over blood. And always, it ends with a name almost lost, but never forgotten, because the wind still whispers their names. It calls them from the corners of ghost towns, from the cracks in canyon walls, from the ashes of old fires that never truly went out. And if you listen, truly listen, you'll hear them, not as echoes, but as a warning, a promise. They lived, they fought, they endured, and they left behind a truth too wild to be buried, that the West was never just a man's world. It was a woman's trial, a woman's fire, a woman's legacy. Every inch of dust that covers this land has been touched by the hands of those the world forgot. Every trail you ride, every legend you hear, has a woman's shadow stitched quietly behind it. The men died loud, but the women lived louder. And even now, when the wind cuts through the ruins of what they built, it carries their defiance like a hymn that won't die. They said the West ended long ago, but it didn't. It waits, in the dust, in the bones, in the names that history left behind. And the wind, the same wind that once carried their laughter, still whispers, over and over, remember us. Remember what we did. Remember who we were. The West forgot them. But I didn't. And neither will you. Because as long as someone listens, as long as someone speaks their names, they'll never truly fade. And somewhere, beyond the edge of the desert, where the wind meets the silence, they lay still riding, still waiting, still alive. They called it the frontier, a place where a man could make his fortune, stake his claim, carve out his name in the dust. That's what the stories said. But those stories never told you who cooked his food, who washed his wounds, who buried him when the desert finally took him. The truth is the West wasn't built by heroes. It was built by the forgotten, by the hands that didn't get written down, while the songs sang about cowboys and gold rushes. The women were out there too, hauling water through droughts, keeping the fire alive through winters that turned men to stone, and praying that the sound in the dark wasn't a raid, or a man who'd come back meaner than he left. They went west for all kinds of reasons. Some to disappear, some to be free, some because there was nowhere else left to go. But no matter the reason, the land didn't care. It took everything and gave nothing easy in return. Lawlessness wasn't a word. It was a way of breathing. And out here, the law had a face, usually a man's, and his eyes never saw them coming. A woman could walk into a town with a new name, and the world would look right past her. No one asked questions. No one cared where she came from. And that invisibility, it became her weapon. Because while men built their legends with bullets, women survived with silence. They traded secrets like currency. They learned when to stand still, and when to vanish before sunrise. They were teachers, widows, midwives, runaways. And every one of them knew that out here, freedom came at a price. And sometimes that price was blood. They saw things no man would ever write down. They saw towns die before they ever lived. They saw what the frontier really was. Not a dream, but a trial. A test to see who could keep breathing when everything around them was turning to dust. The men called it courage when they killed for land. But they called it madness when a woman fought to keep her own life. That's how it always was. The cowboy got the glory. The woman got the grave. And yet, somehow, they endured. They outlived the outlaws and the sheriffs, the preachers and the judges, because the world underestimated what desperation can become when it wears a woman's face. Some of them wore bonnets by day and carried knives by night. Some sang hymns in the morning and buried secrets by sunset. Some bore children to men they didn't love, and buried those men when the time came to stop pretending. The West was supposed to break them. Instead, they broke the rules. Every trail you've ever heard about, every legend you've ever romanticized, was written on the backs of women who refused to vanish. And the law never saw them coming, because it wasn't looking for them. It was looking past them. That's how they survived. Not by being seen, but by being overlooked. Not by being remembered, but by being erased. And sometimes, that's the only way a woman could live long enough to become a legend. So the next time you hear about the Wild West, the sheriffs, the outlaws, the gunfights at noon, remember what the stories don't say. That behind every dead man in the dust, there was a woman who learned what the law never did. That survival isn't about justice. It's about endurance. And endurance was something the West never understood until it looked into the eyes of the women it forgot. Every time we skip their stories, every time we scroll past their names, every time we act like they never mattered, we prove the West was right to erase them. Don't be part of that silence. Hit subscribe, or tell me in the comments why you think their voices don't deserve a place. They say only 5% of outlaws in the West were women. 5% small enough for history to forget, but loud enough for the wind to remember. They weren't born killers. They weren't raised for gunfire or prison cells. They were made that way by hunger, by heartbreak, by a world that offered them no other choice. When the law came for them, it called them monsters. But the truth was simpler. They weren't monsters. They were survivors. Take Belle Starr. They called her the Bandit Queen. Said she rode with thieves, lived by the gun, and died by it too. But they never talk about what drove her there, how the same men who once courted her laughter turned their backs the moment she stopped bowing her head. How the law that promised protection was the same one that framed her for crimes she didn't commit. Belle wasn't chasing fame. She was fighting for breath. And when the West pushed her too far, she pushed back. She wore velvet while she robbed, spoke soft while she ordered men twice her size around. They called her vain, but that wasn't vanity. That was control. In a world where women were told to be invisible, Belle Starr chose to be unforgettable. And for that, they killed her, shot her in the back, and wrote her story in the language of shame. A woman gone too far, they said, but they never said how far the world had gone to break her. Then there was Pearl Hart, the last stagecoach robber. She didn't ride for gold. She rode for survival, for a taste of the freedom that men wore like a birthright. She cut her hair, dressed like a man, and when she robbed that coach, she told the passengers, "I need this more than you do." And she meant it. When they caught her, she smiled for the papers, not because she wanted the fame, but because for once, she was seen. The courtroom filled with men who came to gawk, not at the crime, but at the nerve of a woman who refused to apologize for it. They called her dangerous. They called her lost. They called her unfit for mercy. And still, Pearl stood there, calm and proud, while the men who'd broken 10 more laws than she ever did sat in judgment. When they locked her away, she didn't weep. She just said, "I shall never submit to the law again." That wasn't rebellion. That was survival. That was truth. And then there was Eleanor Dumont. They called her Madame Mustache, mocked her for her looks, feared her for her skill. She was a gambler, a dealer, a woman who carved her living from the hands of men who couldn't stand to lose to her. They said she was lucky, but she wasn't. She was precise. She was patient. She read faces like a book, and played cards like a sermon. For years, she walked into smoky saloons, and walked out with her pockets full, and her dignity intact. No man could touch her. No man could own her. And that made her dangerous. But even the strongest hearts break in silence. Loneliness is its own kind of bullet. It doesn't pierce skin. It just wears you down until you forget what you were fighting for. When Eleanor lost the last of her money, she didn't beg. She didn't run. She simply laid her cards on the table, took one last look at the world that never forgave her for surviving, and walked out into the dark. They found her the next morning, head bowed, gun in hand. The West wrote her off as another fallen woman, but those who knew her whispered different, that she'd finally dealt herself the only hand left that men couldn't rig against her. These women, Belle, Pearl, Eleanor, they didn't draw their guns to make history. They did it to live one more day in a world that never meant for them to last even one. Violence was never their dream. It was their language, the only one the West would listen to. And for that, they were hunted. Not because they were evil, but because they proved that a woman could be free. The West had 1,000 ways to tell their stories wrong. But the truth rides quieter. It doesn't shout. It lingers. It waits for someone willing to listen past the myths. So listen, because the wind still whispers their names. Not as villains, not as victims, but as women who dared to draw the line between survival and surrender, and pulled the trigger when the world refused to see the difference. They called them sinners, but when the town burned, Those same women fetched the water. That's the truth the history books never printed. The frontier loved to preach about morality. But when it came to survival, it was always the condemned who kept the world turning. The sheriffs and preachers gave their speeches. But when the saloon burned, when the fever spread, when the children went hungry, it was the women the town had already damned who showed up with buckets, blankets, and bread. They called them fallen, but they were the ones who stood back up when everyone else fell. The West ran on two kinds of people: those who took, and those who patched up what was left after the taking. And most days, the patching was done by women, whose names you'd never dare say out loud in church. The teachers who taught in buildings half-rotten from rain. The healers who stitched wounds by candlelight and prayed the bleeding would stop. The madams who built their brothels with lumber no man paid for, and used their earnings to buy medicine, books, food for the hungry. While the men preached, they built. You see, the frontier couldn't survive on decency. It survived on endurance. And women carried more than any man could bear. When the miners drank their wages away, it was the women who lent the coin to rebuild the schoolhouse. When the church ran out of funds, the madam wrote the check. And when the preacher stood on Sunday and spoke of sin, he did it with the gold those same women earned in the dark. That was the great hypocrisy of the West. It leaned on the shoulders of the women it pretended not to see. They called them whores, widows, witches. But when the crops failed, when the bandits came, when the sheriff bled out in the street, the town didn't pray for saints. It prayed for the women it had already cursed. Some wore lace, some wore rags, some carried babies, some carried knives. But every one of them carried the weight of a town that wouldn't have lasted a week without them. They were the quiet backbone of chaos, holding the line while men played at law and legend. And still, when the dust settled, their names were nowhere to be found. History remembered the sheriffs. It built statues for the judges. It sung songs for the cowboys. But it forgot the women who kept the dead from outnumbering the living. They said women brought sin to the West. But sin had already been there, buried under greed, pride, and the kind of violence men like to call justice. The difference was, women carried theirs out in the open. They didn't hide what they had to do to survive. And maybe that's what scared the West most. Not their sin, but their honesty. Because the truth is ugly. The West was not won by saints. It was built by sinners with calloused hands and tired hearts. By women who were damned by daylight and indispensable by nightfall. They didn't ride for glory. They didn't wear badges. They just kept everything from collapsing. And when the time came, they buried the sheriffs, blessed the sinners, and went back to work. They never asked for thanks. They just wanted to be remembered. And if we forget them, if we keep letting their names fade beneath the dust of men as stories, then we become part of the silence that buried them in the first place. You're watching history the way the West wanted you to from the sidelines. Don't just watch. Join. Because silence isn't neutral. It's how they were buried. Part 5. They say the West was built by men. But that's only half the story. The other half is quieter, harder to see. Because it begins after the gunfire stops. After the dust settles. After the coffin has been lowered into the earth. And the preacher's words fade into wind. That's when the real war began. The war the widows fought. They woke to a world that didn't care. They lost everything. A world that saw their grief as weakness, their strength as rebellion. The men got monuments. The women got more work. But they didn't fall apart. They couldn't. Because no one was coming to save them. So they learned to live like ghosts that refused to die. Some fought with rifles. Some fought with prayer. All fought with silence. And that silence was stronger than any bullet. They called her Clara Brown. She'd been born a slave. and by all rights, she wasn't supposed to live long enough to see freedom. But she did. And when freedom came, it didn't come easy. It came with heartbreak, her husband and children gone, scattered, sold, lost. And in that emptiness, Clara did what no man thought she could. She walked west. They said it was madness. A woman, alone, crossing the mountains. But she walked anyway, step after step, through mud and loss and memory. Not chasing fortune, chasing purpose. She reached Colorado. And when she looked at that barren land, she didn't see dust. She saw beginnings. She washed clothes for miners, cooked for strangers, saved every coin, and turned survival into empire. They called her Aunt Clara, but she wasn't anyone as aunt. She was the backbone of a community that didn't even know it needed one. When others fled the West as chaos, she stayed and built churches, schools, homes. She searched for her lost family for decades, never found them, but never stopped looking. And when she died, they buried her with the title she earned, the Angel of the Rockies. But angels don't fall from heaven. They rise from hell. And Clara Brown proved that.
Then came Lucille Mulhall, the girl who refused to be told what she couldn't do. They called her the first cowgirl, but that title was too small for what she was. She didn't just ride, she ruled the saddle. They said no woman could rope like a man, so she tied down wild bulls until men stopped laughing. They said no woman could lead a rodeo, so she led one with presidents watching. Theodore Roosevelt called her the greatest rider in America, but even then, she was more than a spectacle. Lucille's war wasn't fought in arenas or headlines. It was in every sneer, every man who said, "You're good for a woman." It was in every show she performed. While the papers still called her a novelty instead of a name, but she kept writing, because to stop was to disappear, and Lucille refused to vanish. Her father raised her tough, but the world raised her tougher. She mended fences by hand, broke horses that had broken men, and when the crowds were gone and the noise faded, she went back home and worked the land like it was sacred, because to her, it was. That's what they don't tell you about women like Lucille and Clara. They weren't just surviving, they were redefining survival. They weren't just living in the shadow of the West, they were the light it refused to see. The Frontier Widows' War wasn't about revenge or glory. It was about standing up when there's no one left to stand beside you. It was about knowing that no history book will remember your name, and doing it anyway. They buried their husbands, their children, their dreams, and then they built again, fence by fence, brick by brick, hand by trembling hand. They didn't call it bravery, they just called it Tuesday, because out there, on the edge of everything, strength didn't always wear a badge or ride a horse. Sometimes it just didn't fall apart. These women were the quiet architects of a land that never thanked them. They mended wounds no one saw, kept promises no one remembered, and when the world forgot them, they kept living anyway. That's the kind of courage the West was built on. Not the kind sung about in saloons, but the kind that holds its breath, tightens its jaw, and keeps moving through the ashes. They called them widows, but the truth, they were soldiers, and the battlefield was every sunrise that came after loss. If you think courage only looks like a man on a horse, you'll never see the real West. Subscribe before this channel becomes another campfire gone cold. And if you won't, tell us why in the comments. Let the silence have a reason. They didn't wait for permission. They became the law that never came. The West had plenty of sheriffs, men, who posed for photographs with shiny badges and dusty boots. But the ones who kept the peace, the ones who made sure justice rode through when lawmen turned coward, those stories don't start with a badge. They start with women who carried the weight of a nation on their backs and dared to call it just another day. They called her Mary Fields, but the frontier called her something else, Stagecoach Mary. Born into slavery, freed by faith, hardened by time, she wasn't delicate, she wasn't quiet, and she sure as hell wasn't waiting on anyone's mercy. When the nuns at the convent couldn't get their supplies through the rough country of Montana, Mary stepped up, didn't ask, didn't flinch, she just said, "I'll get it done." And she did. Every single run, no matter the weather, no matter the thieves, no matter the distance, snow, mud, gunfire, didn't matter. The mail got through, because Mary made sure it did. She was 6 feet of unstoppable, carried 2 guns, smoked cigars, and when some fool tried to rob her, she didn't scream, she fired back, hit him once, dragged him to town, and still delivered the mail before sunset. The townsfolk said she was too rough, too loud, too manly. But when winter came and the trails froze, They waited for the sound of her wheels, because if Stagecoach Mary was still riding, hope was still alive. She didn't wear a badge, she didn't need one. Her word was law, her courage, justice. That's the kind of woman the West was built on, the kind the world forgets because she didn't fit its picture of grace. But strength doesn't have to smile, sometimes it just keeps going, one will turn at a time. And then there was Fanny Porter. Her name doesn't sound like law, but in San Antonio, she was the kind of order chaos bowed to. A brothel keeper, yes, but also a businesswoman, a protector, and a power broker in a city that pretended morality while living off her profits. Men called her a sinner, the same men who lined up at her door when their own rules became too heavy to follow. Fanny didn't play their game, she made her own, kept her girls safe, paid her debts, and made sure that even the lawmen, who cursed her name, never dared cross her in daylight. When Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid rode into town, guess where they went? Fanny's place. She treated them with whiskey and warnings, because she understood something the marshals didn't, that the line between law and outlaw was nothing but dust. She played both sides, and both sides respected her for it, because in a world where men made the rules, Fanny Porter was the one who enforced them on her own terms. No badge, no title, just the kind of quiet power that turns fear into obedience. The West didn't know what to do with women like that. They were too wild to worship, too righteous to hang. So history buried them between chapters, a paragraph here, a rumor there. But the truth never really dies. Mary Fields rode through the mountains with bullets in her mail sacks. Fanny Porter ran a kingdom in a town full of kings. And both of them proved one thing the West could never admit. Justice wears many faces, and sometimes it wears rouge and a revolver. They enforced the law the only way the world allowed them to, by breaking it when it broke them, by protecting what was theirs, by standing where men refused to stand. Because when the world won't give you a badge, you carve your own in blood, grit, and legend. These were the women who didn't just live by the law, they became it. They didn't swear oaths in courthouses, they swore them in dust, under the weight of silence and survival. And the wind still remembers their names. Mary, Fanny, two women who prove justice doesn't always come in uniform. Sometimes it walks in heels and holsters, smokes cigars, and rides alone. Part 7. They say the West remembers its dead, but that's not true. It only remembers the ones it chose to. The rest, they lie beneath unmarked stones, beneath dry earth that's forgotten what it covered. No names, no records, just the silence of stories that never made it past the edge of memory. There are graves out there, miles of them, where the markers have long since rotted away, where the wooden crosses have fallen, and the wind is the only thing that still calls their names. They were women who cooked for men who never thanked them, women who buried their children with their own hands, women who rode west for freedom and found only graves waiting. There are graves out there, miles of them, where the markers have long since rotted away, where the wooden crosses have fallen, and the wind is the only thing that still calls their names. They were women who cooked for men who never thanked them, women who buried their children with their own hands, women who rode west for freedom and found only graves waiting. And when they died, the West did what it always did to the inconvenient. It buried them twice, once in the ground, and once in history. You won't find their names in any ledger, you won't see their faces in museums, but sometimes, if you stand still long enough in a forgotten cemetery, you'll feel them. A chill that doesn't belong to weather, a whisper that doesn't belong to wind, a presence that says, we were here. There are graves out there, miles of them, where the markers have long since rotted away, where the wooden crosses have fallen, and the wind is the only thing that still calls their names. They were women who cooked for men who never thanked them, women who buried their children with their own hands, women who rode west for freedom and found only graves waiting. And when they died, the West did what it always did to the inconvenient. It buried them twice, once in the ground, and once in history. You won't find their names in any ledger, you won't see their faces in museums, but sometimes, if you stand still long enough in a forgotten cemetery, you'll feel them. A chill that doesn't belong to weather, a whisper that doesn't belong to wind, a presence that says, we were here. They had names once. Eliza, Ruth, Marguerite, Jane. Names written in ink that rain washed away. Some died in childbirth, some in saloons, some under the weight of rumors that killed quicker than bullets. Others were left behind by wagons that moved on, by men who didn't look back, by a world that didn't see them as worth remembering. When fires swept through old courthouses and churches, records burned, and with them, whole lives turned to smoke. The historians called it loss of data, but it wasn't data, it was them, the letters they wrote, the diaries they hid, the names they signed at the bottom of land deeds they were never meant to own. Gone, all gone. And what's left now? Whispers, rumors, fragments of stories passed from one old mouth to another, until truth and legend became one and the same. They say a woman named Ada once saved a town from starvation, that she hunted, traded, and kept families alive through the long winter. But when she died, the townsfolk buried her outside the fence, because she'd never married. No headstone, no prayer, just dirt and wind. Or the story of Leela, the teacher, who built the first schoolhouse in Kansas, taught children who grew up to be judges and lawmakers. But her records vanished after her death, and when they rebuilt the town, they named the school after the man who supplied the wood. That's how erasure works. Not with violence, but with forgetting. A quiet rewriting, a silence that grows so loud it drowns the truth. Every lost record, every nameless grave, every photograph burned in the fire, they aren't just pieces of the past. They're the echoes of a warning, because history doesn't just forget on its own. Someone decides what gets remembered. Someone chooses who lives on in the telling. And for these women, no one chose. But here you are, listening, hearing their ghosts between every word, feeling the weight of their absence like dust on your skin. You are their witness now, and witnesses have choices. If you walk away without subscribing, their stories die here again, in silence, in darkness, unmarked, unspoken. Don't let this be their second burial. Keep their names alive, because you might be the last person who ever hears them. They say the West remembers its dead, but that's not true. It only remembers the ones it chose to. The rest, they lie beneath unmarked stones, beneath dry earth that's forgotten what it covered. No names, no records, just the silence of stories that never made it past the edge of memory. There are graves out there, miles of them, where the markers have long since rotted away, where the wooden crosses have fallen, and the wind is the only thing that still calls their names. They were women who cooked for men who never thanked them, women who buried their children with their own hands, women who rode west for freedom and found only graves waiting. And when they died, the West did what it always did to the inconvenient. It buried them twice, once in the ground, and once in history. You won't find their names in any ledger, you won't see their faces in museums, but sometimes, if you stand still long enough in a forgotten cemetery, you'll feel them. A chill that doesn't belong to weather, a whisper that doesn't belong to wind, a presence that says, we were here. They had names once: Eliza, Ruth, Marguerite, Jane, names written in ink that rain washed away. Some died in childbirth, some in saloons, some under the weight of rumors that killed quicker than bullets. Others were left behind by wagons that moved on, by men who didn't look back, by a world that didn't see them as worth remembering. When fires swept through old courthouses and churches, records burned, and with them, whole lives turned to smoke. The historians called it loss of data, but it wasn't data, it was them, the letters they wrote, the diaries they hid, the names they signed at the bottom of land deeds they were never meant to own. Gone, all gone. And what's left now? Whispers, rumors, fragments of stories passed from one old mouth to another, until truth and legend became one and the same. They say a woman named Ada once saved a town from starvation, that she hunted, traded, and kept families alive through the long winter. But when she died, the townsfolk buried her outside the fence, because she'd never married. No headstone, no prayer, just dirt and wind. Or the story of Leela, the teacher, who built the first schoolhouse in Kansas, taught children who grew up to be judges and lawmakers. But her records vanished after her death, and when they rebuilt the town, they named the school after the man who supplied the wood. That's how erasure works. Not with violence, but with forgetting. A quiet rewriting, a silence that grows so loud it drowns the truth. Every lost record, every nameless grave, every photograph burned in the fire, they aren't just pieces of the past. They're the echoes of a warning, because history doesn't just forget on its own. Someone decides what gets remembered. Someone chooses who lives on in the telling. And for these women, no one chose. But here you are, listening, hearing their ghosts between every word, feeling the weight of their absence like dust on your skin. You are their witness now, and witnesses have choices. If you walk away without subscribing, their stories die here again, in silence, in darkness, unmarked, unspoken. Don't let this be their second burial. Keep their names alive, because you might be the last person who ever hears them. They didn't need saving, they needed remembering. And remembering, real remembering, is a kind of resurrection, because every time we speak their names, every time we tell their stories out loud, they rise from the dust again. The women of the old frontier are gone, but their spirit never left. It just changed shape. It's in every woman who refuses to be told what she can't do, in every voice that cuts through the noise and says, I'm still here. They carved a path through wilderness and judgment so others could walk it without bleeding. They didn't have movements or slogans. They didn't have safety nets or spotlights. They had grit, they had silence, and they had the kind of defiance that makes history nervous. When they rode west, the world told them what they couldn't be. When they got there, they became it anyway. And even now, a century later, their rebellion still echoes. You can hear it in the way women tell their own stories today, without asking permission. You can see it in the ones who build, fight, lead, and refused to be written out of their own history. The frontier was never about land. It was about boundaries, and the ones who dared to cross them. That's the legacy that rode on, not the guns or the gold or the dust, but the will to exist loudly in a world that demanded silence, the will to be more than what they were told they could be, to work without recognition, to live without apology. They called them wild, they called them wicked, they called them women, and somehow, that last one was the greatest rebellion of all. The old stories painted them as background, the wives, the widows, the outlaws' lovers, but the truth is simpler. They were the West. They carried it on their backs, breathed life into its bones, and left their fingerprints on every story that followed. Their bloodlines may be scattered, their graves unmarked, but their legacy isn't buried. It's in every woman who walks through the world and refuses to bow her head, in every voice that dares to say, I am not forgotten, because the West didn't die, it just changed names, and it still rides, every time a woman claims her story and refuses to hand it over. They were never waiting to be rescued, they were waiting to be remembered, and now, finally, they are. The men built statues, the women became the stories, and stories, they don't rust. The wind still carries them, through ghost towns, through broken fences, through silence. You can still hear them, the laughter, the grit, the breath that refused to quit. They were the heartbeat of a land that tried to bury them, and still, they rise. They weren't saints, they weren't angels, they were women, and that was enough. Enough to build, enough to fight, enough to endure, enough to be remembered. If you felt the dust on your skin, the ache of a forgotten name, or the weight of a story too long buried, then this is your campfire. Subscribe, stay close, because once the flame goes out there's no telling who the wind will forget next. We were here,